All right, well, let's take our Bibles. We're in the book of John, so I'd like you to turn with me, not to John 11, but this time to John 21. We're in a series that we've been in for a number of weeks called Knowing Jesus. And I've been saying over and over again, the best way to know Jesus is to listen to what Jesus says about himself. And so we've been studying what is called the I am sayings of Jesus. There are 7 of them through the book of John. We are now studying the last one. I think is, we've saved the best for last. John chapter 11, verse 25, he says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, even if you would die, you won't really die. And we're about halfway through that story, and we're going to get there in a moment. But I want you to see the end of the book of John. John concludes the story of Jesus with these words, the last verse of the last chapter, John 21:25. Now, there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. In other words, he is saying, I think in a bit of hyperbole, that Jesus did all kinds of other miracles. He taught all kinds of other lessons. He encountered all kinds of other people. They're not all written in this book. He writes about 7 sayings. He also writes about 7 miracles. He says, that's it. I could have written about a lot more. I only wrote about 7. Why is that? Because that's all that was needed. You see, the whole purpose of the book of John is to prove that Jesus is who he says he really is. Remember, I showed you the purpose statements in John chapter 20, beginning in verse 30. Flip over there, one page. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, very much like the verse we just read. But then it goes on to the purpose statement. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. That's an apologetic purpose statement. Why is he writing? So that you and I would believe who Jesus is, that he is the Christ, that he is the Son of God. Now, why is he writing? Well, he continues, so this is an evangelistic reading, that by believing you may have life in his name. You see what John wants? John wants you to be so convinced of who Jesus is that it just won't be sitting in your head, but it will move and penetrate to the rest of your life and into your heart, and you will believe that Jesus is who he says he is. Now, come with me over to John chapter 11, back to the story. John 11 is all about Jesus saying, I am the resurrection and the life, and then proving it with one of the greatest miracles. He raises Lazarus from the dead. You see, it's one thing to say that I am the resurrection and the life. It's another thing then to prove it. You see, and basically that's where he's at. He says, I have power over death. I have power over life. Now he's in a situation that he has to prove it. We're in the middle of the story, so if you're just joining us, I think you're getting in on the story at the very best part. Let me just catch you up on where we're at. A man named Lazarus was ill. His 2 sisters, Martha and Mary, they write or get word to Jesus, who is some distance off, about a 2-day journey, that Lazarus is very ill. They're asking him to come and heal him. Jesus waits. He doesn't come right away. This is an opportunity to demonstrate his glory and to glorify that he is the Son of God. Going back to what? The purpose of the entire book. In that meantime, Lazarus dies. He shows up in the village. Martha meets him and says, Lord, if you would have just come sooner, I know you would have healed him. And Jesus, in his compassionate way, see that she's reacting in grief and looks at her and says, it's all right. He's going to live again. He's going to rise from the dead. She says, I know that, Lord. She's thinking future. He says, no. I mean right now. I am the resurrection and the life. Then Martha's Sister Mary shows up on the scene, says almost the exact same thing. Jesus goes through the exact same dialogue. And he prepares then for the miracle. And that's where we pick up the story in verse 38. So we're going to work through this just like we've been through the last couple of weeks, kind of like a Bible study. We're just going to go through verse by verse. We're going to stop when it's appropriate. We're going to pick up where we need to. And then we're going to continue on. We're going to see what the story tells us as it unfolds. Verse 38, Lazarus is in the tomb. Then Jesus, deeply moved again. Now stop right there. We can't go very far. Do you see the word again? What does this mean that Jesus is deeply moved again? Well, it means that this must have happened before. So back up just so that we see it. Look at verse 33. When Jesus saw her, this is Mary, weeping, and the Jews who had come with her weeping, in other words, he's in the middle of the funeral, they're still mourning. He was deeply moved, same word, in his spirit, and greatly troubled. Now we have some additional information. He was deeply moved and greatly troubled. This is where it is important to work in and in depth in the study of the Word of God. Because you could just look at that and you could make the assumption, okay, funeral, friend has died, he's deeply troubled, deeply moved, we've been there, we know what that's like, he's very sad about the situation. No, that's not what this means. These words, when you start to dig a little deeper, you find out they have a meaning which you might not expect. In fact, this word deeply moved means to roar, means to storm with rage. He's angry. And then this other word, greatly troubled, it means as if you were agitating water in a pool. Think about going over and hitting the button on a hot tub and all the water starts agitating. That's the visual image here. He is angry and he is stirred up over the death of Lazarus. Now, don't miss it that he's also emotionally moved. Look at verse 35. It says, he wept. It's the shortest verse in the Bible. First verse I ever memorized. Easiest verse in the Bible to memorize, verse 35. He wept. So he's angry and he's sad. Is that even possible? I mean, can you be angry and sad at the same time? Well, if you grew up in northeastern Ohio and you're a sports fan, you can say, yes, I've experienced that multiple times. Yes, we understand you can be angry and sad at the same time. You can say there's an injustice, and I'm sad because of the injustice, and that's basically what he's saying. He has a friend who is dead, who's in the tomb. And he's emotionally in tune with that. Why? Because he's fully human and fully God. So his fully human side is heartbroken that his friend is dead. His fully God side is agitated, angered. Why? Because of the effect of sin. Remember in the beginning, it was the Trinity that created us. It was the Trinity in the garden. It was the Trinity that created the perfection. Jesus was there, and Jesus was there at the fall. You see, he saw what it could have been, and he saw what it is. And he's angered, not only at the death of a friend, but death through all of the ages. He's agitated by that. Now, there's a crowd around him. We keep reading the story, and we see that he tells them to remove the stone. So he says here in this passage that the cave was covered and stone was laid against it, and he says, take away the stone. And Martha, the sister of the dead man, says to him, Lord, by this time there'll be an odor, for he's been dead for 4 days, which then again verifies that Lazarus is dead. 4 days, second time we've seen this. This is a legitimate miracle that's about to occur. He's not dead just momentarily. Someone couldn't come along and accuse him of playing dead. We couldn't say this was a conspiracy to say that Jesus raised a dead man who wasn't really dead. No, this is a man who was legitimately dead. He's been in the tomb 4 days. And notice what Martha is concerned about? She's concerned that there might be an odor. Now, there's a stone in front of the cave for a reason. It's not to keep people in, it's to keep people out. Grave robbers, animals. It was also for another very practical reason, keep odor in. And when they opened that tomb, she was thinking odor was about ready to come out. And in fact, I love the King James version. Said, he's going to stinketh. And that's the reality. Because see, in the Jewish culture, it wasn't like the Egyptian culture where they took everything out of the body and put it in little nice kettles inside the body and washed the body and mummified the body. No, if you died, you went from death right into the tomb. And so all of the body, the corpse by this time was decomposing. The natural process was taking place, and she understood this. She said, I'm not sure if you really want to do that. Jesus said, no. Move the tomb. Move the stone. Well, Martha's a bit appalled by this. And Jesus says to her, did I not tell you that if you believe, you would see the glory of God? Now, what is Jesus saying? Jesus is saying gently to her, I told you I'm the resurrection and the life. And I am the resurrection and the life right now. Now, we can't be too critical of her. We can't blame her if she's struggling with this. Jesus asks us to trust him with much smaller things, and we struggle, don't we? One commentator says this, the problem is she had her thoughts on the corpse and not on Christ. That's a visual, isn't it? I tried to modernize this in my own mind, so I like to say it this way. We often think about our own junk and not about Jesus. Our own junk tends to get in the way when Jesus should be the one that we're looking at. Well, Jesus prays this amazing prayer. So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. Isn't that a beautiful relationship prayer? It tells us, gives us an insider's glimpse into the relationship between God the Father and God the Son. God the Father listens to God the Son. Verse 42, and I knew that you always hear me, which, by the way, do you know that he always hears you as a son and daughter of God? You might not always feel that way. You might think my prayers are bouncing all around the universe. I don't know. Maybe I'm not worthy. My sin last night has cut me off from God. There's nothing in the scriptures that speak that way. Once you have received the Spirit of God and dwelled in you, you always have a direct conversation with God the Father and God the Father with you, and he's always listening. But I said this on account of the people standing around me, that they might believe that you sent me. Do you realize it always goes back to the purpose? Remember, what's the purpose? These things are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and so that in believing you might have life in his name. You see, he's always pointing back to the purpose, and that's what he's saying. I'm praying to you, and I'm doing this so that they might believe. So he's driving towards a point, and what's the point? Raising Lazarus from the dead. Now, you got to think about this, because we're kind of moving there dramatically in the passage. And you have to wonder if the people aren't anticipating it too. Because here's Jesus, and there's a crowd around him. He's told them to move the stone away, and so these men come around, and they move this huge stone out in front of the cave, which, by the way, would have been taboo, because now that he's about ready to be disqualified himself from going before the Passover and into the temple, because now he's close to a dead body, and that was something that you weren't allowed to do. He's defacing this grave, and now he's claiming he's about ready to do a miraculous thing that no one has ever done. You have to assume there was this heightened anticipation of what was about to take place. And what do we read in verse 43? And when he had said these things, and when he got done praying, he cried with a loud voice, notice this, A name and a verb, that's it. A name and a verb. Lazarus, come out. That's it. Now, Hollywood would like to trump this up with smoke coming out of the tomb and all of this sound effect. It's just Jesus. Loud voice, Lazarus, come out. Now, he's very specific. He didn't yell into the tomb, come out. You don't want to do that. Everybody might have started coming out. So he's very specific. He's limited. I'm talking to you, Lazarus. Come out. And then there's got to have been this moment. You see, if Lazarus, and you got to anticipate this for a moment, if Lazarus doesn't come out, Jesus is a fraud and a lunatic. Because he's standing right before all these people. And he's claiming that he's the resurrection and the life, and he's claiming that he can raise the dead. So this is a moment. If Lazarus doesn't come out, there's no more followers after this. If Lazarus doesn't come out, he's going to be crucified that night as a blasphemer of God. So there had to have been all of this tension. And what happens next? No fanfare, no fireworks, no Hollywood drama. Verse 44, the man who had died came out. That's it. You know why that's it? Because this isn't about Lazarus, this is about Jesus. Amen. You see, we look at that and we're like, he came out? Well, what just happened? You've been dead for 4 days. I mean, I'm sure there was some publicist in the background that came running to the foreground with a contract in his hand. Sign here, Lazarus. I'll make you rich before the end of the afternoon. You're going to tell us everything that just happened in the last 4 days and what you saw. We all want to know. Right? I mean, that's what we want to know. We'd be running up, Lazarus, what did you see? The story doesn't tell us that. Why? Because it's not about Lazarus. It's about Jesus. Lazarus, it says, comes out. His hands, his feet are bound with linen straps, his face wrapped with cloth. And Jesus says to them, unbind him and let him go. So you got to think about this. He's got these cloth strips around his face and he comes out. He was dead. He wasn't just dead, he was a corpse. He was in the process of decomposing. A name and a verb, and like that, he sits up and comes out of the tomb. There must have been the world's largest gasp at that moment from the crowd. Do you remember what the disciples said when Jesus calmed the storm when they were in the boat? They all looked at each other and they were flabbergasted. And they said, who is this man that even the waves obey him? Now, I picture the disciples, after seeing thousands of miracles, standing over in the corner, kind of, yeah, he's doing it again. Everybody else blowing their mind. Do you remember what Jesus said in Revelation 1:18? I hold the keys to death and Hades. Do you get it now? He says, I hold all the power over life and death. You know, remember what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15? Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where's your victory? O death, where is your sting? And Jesus is standing in front of Lazarus' tomb and he says, death doesn't have a sting anymore. You see, this is what's going on here. The most dramatic visual moment in history, the Son of God making the most shocking statement, I am the resurrection and the life. By the way, why is that so shocking? Because we're all on the way to death. We're all going to face death. And then he proves he is who he says he is. He raises a man from the dead. Now, I don't want you to miss the big picture here. Because you need to remember that even though this is the apex miracle of the Gospel of John, it's called a sign, not a miracle. You see, we've been studying the 7 I am sayings of Jesus. Do you also realize that there are 7 signs or miracles through the Gospel of John? It's interesting, all of the Gospel of John is filled with the number 7. And that's an interesting study on its own. There's 7 sayings, there's also 7 miracles, but these miracles are called signs. You know why they're called signs? Because they're not just miracles, they point to something that we need to understand. They point to something that has a spiritual meaning. Let me just walk you through them very quickly. The first miracle or sign was Jesus turning water to wine at the wedding of Cana. Now, this might think of as a small miracle, right? He takes water and he turns it to wine. I had a gentleman come up with after the first service and he said, really, that wasn't just a miracle of turning water to wine. It was also a miracle of time, because it takes time to make wine. I thought, yeah, that's a good point. Nonetheless, Jesus turned water, drinking water, into wine at a wedding. Now, just by the way, I don't know if you realize this, but the imagery that Jesus uses through the gospel is that the kingdom is a party. Do you know that? I mean, think of the parable of the banquet. The king throws a banquet, and he invites all these important people, but nobody comes. And so he tells the son, go out and go into the highways and byways and the bushes and invite people who normally wouldn't be invited to come into the king's banquet. And we understand that as an invitation to us, to the king's party, and that's what the kingdom is going to be like. And you think about Jesus, what does Jesus say the kingdom's going to be like? It's like the marriage feast. And what is the very first miracle he performs? He performs it at a wedding. He turns water into wine. Do you get this? We are on our way to a banquet, to a party. We're just passing through. Don't get caught up in the world that we're in right now. You see, too many of us get enamored with the people who are here, who are dead. Don't get caught up with this world and the stuff of this world. You're just moving through and you've got a kingdom to come and there's a party that's waiting. You get that? That's coming for you, the children of God. The kingdom is a banquet. And where does he start? He says, well, let me just show you this. I'm going to turn water into wine. And I love this. In John chapter 2, it says, this is the first sign that Jesus did at Cana in Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed him. The second one is the healing of the official son. Now, what does this demonstrate? This demonstrates Jesus has power over sickness. This is good for us to hear, isn't it? How many of you struggle with a sickness or an illness or a disability or a diagnosis? Who really has the power? The other question you could ask is, well, why do I have this? For the glory of Jesus. Third is the healing of the blind man, the lame man, the paralyzed man. Remember, he's laying by the pool. He can't get in the pool. The water is stirred. He can't get in time. What's that symbolize? Well, it symbolizes the helpless state, the spiritual helpless state that we're all in. Unless God doesn't act, we cannot move. And then my favorite, the feeding of the 5,000. Oh, I would have loved to have been there, wouldn't you? I mean, Jesus walking around teaching, there's all these thousands of people, and there's this little boy with a Lunchable, and he turns it in and he feeds everybody. Can you imagine that? And what's he saying? He says, I'm the bread of life. See, you think it's impossible? Well, I major in the impossible. Then Jesus walks on water. That's the power over nature. Gives sight to the man who was born blind. That's, again, the spiritual blindness. And in fact that we're in darkness. Jesus says, I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. I mean, all of these are pointing. These are signs. These are miracles with a purpose. You say, well, all right, well, how do we apply the resurrection of Lazarus? Now, how do I apply that to me? Well, all right, well, what does the Bible say about us? That we are what in trespasses and sin? We are dead in trespasses and sin. You see, we are in the tomb. We are helpless. We're like Lazarus. There's nothing we can do. We're like corpses laying dead before God until He calls a name and a verb. And when He calls your name and He says, come out, what happens? You sit straight up and you show up at the entrance of your tomb. And what you once were, dead, a rotting corpse, you're now a living, breathing disciple of Jesus Christ. Do you understand? We walk in the world of the dead. And yet some of you called by name and a verb, and you've been called out. Do you see that? Do you realize you play a role in the redemptive story of Jesus? Whoa, how's that work? You say, only Jesus can raise the dead. You're right. Only Jesus can raise the dead. And here's the thing. You got to let God do what only God can do, and you do what only you can do. Catch that? You got to let God do what only God can do, and you got to do what you can do. Because even in this story, there are things that God calls on people to do. Did you notice it? Jesus standing there, and He tells people, take that stone and move it off of the cave. Now, couldn't He have done that? Couldn't He have just said, stone, roll away from the cave? Move the hand, boom, stone moves away. No, He calls other people to come. Guys, get over there, push that stone away. Some guys show up, push the stone away. Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus comes to the entrance of the tomb. He's all wrapped up. He could have just waved of his hands and all those could have fallen off of him. What does He say? Hey, can some of you unwrap Lazarus? Do you get that? You see, God uses us in the redemptive story because He made you alive to tell the message. Do you remember a few years ago when the guy out in California was driving? He was on all the talk shows. He was driving his car, and it was like 3 a.m., 3:30 or something like this in the morning, and there's an earthquake. It rumbles his car, and he stops. And he lives in California, so he's used to earthquakes, so he's not that concerned about it, and he waits till it. He says, all right, it's over. He gets back on the road and starts going. And he gets on a bridge, and he says, the taillights in front of me, is quite a bit ways ahead of me, suddenly just disappeared. And he thought, that was the strangest thing. And he's on a bridge, and he stops. And he says, it's a good thing I stopped when I did. I just felt like something was telling me to stop because the middle section of the bridge had collapsed. And about 75 feet down, that car was down in there, and they had plummeted to their death. You see, he looked behind him, and he saw a set of car lights coming. And he got out in the middle of the road, and he started waving his hands. Now, imagine 3:30 in the morning in California highway outside of L.A., some guy waving his hands on the side of the road. Would you stop? Probably not. And he said they didn't either, and 4 cars went flying by him at 70 miles an hour and went flying off the edge of that bridge. He said he was panicked because he turned around and he saw a bus, and he only could assume it was filled with people. And he decided there and then that if that bus was going to go across the bridge, it was going to take him with him. And so he gets in the middle of that road, and he takes his shirt off, and he starts flaring that shirt and flapping. He's acting like a lunatic in the middle of the road, and the bus is bearing down, and he's playing chicken with this bus, and it's flapping its its lights and it's beeping its horn, and it's not slowing down. He says, but I decided I was not going to move. Finally, the bus driver slams on the brakes and comes just within feet of him. The bus driver gets out and he's cursing. He pulls him over to the side of the road and he says, look. And the bus driver bursts into tears, hugs the guy, jumps back into the bus and turns it sideways so that nobody else could go any further. Now imagine, if you were that first person on that scene, what would you have done? You would have done the same thing, right? You would have gotten out and you would have acted like a complete idiot to stop anybody and everybody from taking that plunge of death over the end of that highway. Well, what's stopping us from doing that even now? We have people all around us who are dead. And we have a story like Lazarus. Now, think about this honestly. If I asked you, I handed you a card, and I asked you to write down the names of 3 people that you know who don't know Jesus, could you do that? Or have you inundated yourself so much in the Christian bubble that you don't know anybody who's dying, lost, in the tomb, separated from Christ? Arthur Pink, one of the great Reformed theologians, says this: there's no higher privilege this side of heaven than for us to be used of the Lord in rolling away gravestones and removing grave clothes. No higher calling. I have a neighbor, lives just beside me. Pretty sure he doesn't know the Lord. He's got one of the nastiest dogs I've ever seen. Runs up and down the fence, barks and growls at me. And I decided I was going to try to get to know my neighbor. But first I had to get to know his dog. So I went out to the store and I bought a big box of these dog biscuits, these dog bones. And every time that dog got let out of the house, he would run up and down, and I would go over and just kind of stick the dog biscuit through the fence. And he'd take it and then run around. And then next day he'd come out and he'd run up and down, and I'd do the same thing. And I did this for a while until finally he started coming out, and he wouldn't go quite as fast. And he's a big thing, and he doesn't quite have a tail. That got chopped off, so he's got this little stubby thing. And I just noticed the other day that thing was just kind of humming. And he was standing at the fence looking at me, waiting for that dog biscuit. See, if I can meet the dog, I can meet the neighbor. Get to know him. And maybe have a conversation. And maybe start a friendship. And maybe that friendship will lead to a conversation one day. Now, I can tell you this, it would be very easy for me to spend my life next to him hating his dog and never trying to meet him. You see, we are alive in Christ, and we have a story to tell. And you put yourself out there, there's no greater adventure in life than to watch someone hear their name be called by Jesus Christ and walk out of the tomb. And then one day to have them sitting next to you with a Bible in hand and walking them through those first elementary days of trying to figure out where in the world is the book of John. You want to be on that trip. Jesus called you to be on that trip. I have a friend of mine, we play golf together. We play golf with another guy who takes us to some very nice golf courses. And when we go with him, he makes all the rules. In fact, my friend says, not my circus, not my monkey. In other words, he gets to make all the rules. You know what I realize? This is not our circus, not our monkey. This is Jesus Christ calling us to his purpose. And he's called you by name. And now he's called you to go. We don't have to make it hard. Get up, walk across the room, walk across the office, walk across the neighborhood. Start that relationship for the glory of Christ. Stand with me, will you? Put that person's name in your mind, will you, right now? Now let's pray. Oh God, I pray for the names of the men, the women, the young people that are coming to the living ones' minds, the ones you have called forth from the grave. Would you use us as ambassadors to roll back gravestones, take off grave clothes? May we be used of you to introduce them into the great kingdom that awaits them. Oh God, may we have a passion to be people who are ones who love the truth enough to believe it. And believe it so much that we too would go to great lengths so the dead might hear. Would you do something that only you can do? Raise the dead. Oh God, but use our story. If that be your will, glorify yourself through us. And all of God's people said, amen.
This has been a message from The Chapel in Akron, Ohio. For more information about The Chapel, or to listen to more of these types of life-applicable messages, please go to our website at thechapel.life.